Hello, welcome to the second segment of the episode on informal economy and social reproduction in the Global South of the Dev Track podcast series. My name is Surbhi Kesar. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Economics at SOAS. Today, I'm in a conversation with Sara Stevano, brilliant scholar who's a development and feminist political economist and a leading voice in the field of social reproduction theory, which is what we will be focusing on today. By way of a professional introduction, let me say that Sara Stevano is a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS University of London and has held teaching and research positions previously at University of West of England, Bristol, and King's College London. Her areas of study are the political economy of work, food and nutrition, inequalities, and social reproduction. Her work focuses on Africa, with primary research experience in Mozambique and Ghana. Sara is committed to expanding the boundaries of economic research and teaching through interdisciplinary approaches, qualitative methods, and micro-macro bridges. I personally have learned a lot from Sara's work, and she is an inspiration for many of us. On that note, let me begin by welcoming you, Sara, and taking part in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Surbhi. My pleasure. Thank you so much for the generous introduction as well.
Thank you, Sara. Why don't you start us off with explaining what is social reproduction and how do you use social reproduction in your work?
Thank you, Surbhi. I think it is a very good starting point to clarify what social reproduction is, because I find that there is a lot of confusion on what is actually meant by social reproduction. And in fact, in some ongoing research that I'm conducting with Alessandra Mezzadri, who's a colleague in development studies here at SOAS, and Yu Ying Zhu, who's one of our PhD students in economics, always here at SOAS, we have found that social reproduction, or more simply reproduction, in much literature simply means biological reproduction. So it simply refers to childbearing and rearing. But in fact, social reproduction is a much wider concept. And many people might not be familiar with this language because it is specifically rooted in the Marxist and socialist feminisms of the 1970s and 80s. So you have to be familiar with that kind of, with those feminisms in order to understand what social reproduction really means. And with the rise of neoliberalism, these feminisms were marginalized for some decades, but are now becoming more recognized and relevant for contemporary feminist scholarship and activism. And social reproduction approaches are very central to this revival from my perspective. So what is social reproduction? Social reproduction encompasses all the work, whether it is unpaid or paid, and the material practices that are needed to reproduce life and capitalist relations. In pragmatic terms, this means that social reproduction includes buying food, preparing food, taking care of people in our families and beyond, taking care of the environment, if we consider social reproduction in a broader sense, in which we think not only about a human life, but also non-human life, but also all of those sectors that in many countries in the world are managed by the state that are responsible for providing education, healthcare, basic infrastructure. And often this is not really considered as part of social reproduction, but it is a part of social reproduction also to take part in rituals and ceremonies that are important in order to maintain the social fabric of our economies and societies. So all of this, what I've mentioned, which puts together the sort of messy, fleshy stuff of the everyday life, as well as the more intergenerational structured practices. And I'm using the language of geographer Cindy Katz, and I personally use the kind of definition of social reproduction that Katz provided us with in early 2000s. So all of this is necessary for the regeneration of life, as well as the socioeconomic system we live in. And clearly, when something goes wrong in social reproduction, then we face problems across economies and societies. And many are talking about a crisis of social reproduction. So when some of the activities that I've mentioned are not carried out properly in our societies. So Quite briefly, but I can explain that in my work, I see social reproduction as a necessary lens to understand the organization of economic activity in everyday life, but also to link what happens at what in economics we call the microeconomic level. So in households, in the workplace, or in specific contexts, with broader and more systemic conditions and processes. So for me, since much of my research started with more of a microeconomic lens, and I was never satisfied that I could explain what I was trying to explain by simply resting at the microeconomic level. Social reproduction approaches represented a way to connect the micro everyday realities with these broader structural macro processes of change in the global economy.
That's very interesting, Sarah. What you tell me about social reproduction also makes me think about, from the last episode when we were talking about informal economy, how it is such a critical part and how even those economies can't really be understood without this lens of social reproduction. So, this brings me to the second question. How is it that the social reproduction lens adds to our understanding of work and employment?
Right. And this is another important point because I believe that the majority of us, when we think of work, we tend to automatically consider wage work more specifically, or maybe paid work, which could include also self-employment. But we think about forms of work that come with a payment, most often in cash, right? But in fact, for the vast majority of people in the world, work is much more than wage or paid work. So first, work is also unpaid. And this is a long-standing feminist trope. I can quote Silvia Federici from the 1970s, particularly 1974, when she said, "They say it is love, we say it is unwaged work." And this was in the context of seeking to denaturalize women's unpaid work in households and families, which was an important area of not only feminist scholarship, but also political struggle in the 1970s and 80s. But in addition to considering also unpaid work as being part of what we should consider as work, what a social reproduction perspective really adds is the ways in which work is organized in a workplace as connected and being themselves determined by the organization of work outside the workplace. So it's to see work in this continuum, if you want. So laboring in a workplace and working in families and in communities to provide care and sustenance are intimately interconnected, right? And they are part of the organization of everyday life. So, of course, it is only a partial win, if we can consider it a win at all, if women get access to decent jobs in the labor market, but do not lose the responsibilities for unpaid work in their homes and communities. Or if other women from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds take up their roles as underpaid domestic workers and nannies in their families, right? So social reproduction is about trying to bring this all together and see how it is all part of the same picture. And this is a reality that we need to understand if we want to understand how people engage with different forms of work and the kind of inequalities that are reproduced in the process. So when we see work in this expanded way, we also appreciate how in contexts characterized by large and persistent informal economies, which is of course something that we talked about in the first segment of this episode. In this context, ordinary people face very significant challenges in combining low-paid work with social reproduction work that they must take on for their survival. And these are some of the issues that I think are very key from an economic and social perspective, as well as a development perspective in across the world today, but particularly in the global south and in post-colonial contexts.
Sarah, this reminds me of that old criticism to that post of 8 hours work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of what we'll be. that where is the time for social reproduction? So, with that, I want to open it up to the next question that can you provide an illustration of what we've been discussing based on your research in Mozambique?
So Mozambique is a country that I think is quite clearly located in the so-called periphery of the global economy. What does it mean? It means that processes of development in the country are conditioned on the relations that the country has with other countries and contexts in the world. Whether these economic relations are direct or indirect, okay, but there is a conditioning essentially. And as such, Mozambique is characterized by an economic structure that is largely based on the extraction of natural resources and the production of primary commodities for export. So Mozambique is one of the many African countries that experienced high economic growth in GDP terms between the early 2000s and 2015 in particular. But this growth has failed to create jobs in general, but more specifically good jobs that allow people to have forms of employment that really lift them out of poverty. And in fact, the country remains a low-income country today with very high poverty levels. An important part of this story is that processes of capital accumulation in Mozambique tend to rely on the systematic remuneration of labor below the costs of social reproduction. What does it mean in simpler terms? That wages that are paid to workers in the contexts where there is some wage work available are incredibly low and generally not sufficient to make a living. And that means that there is an expanding so-called surplus population, right? So we have a majority of the population that can be described as being surplus, which means that it is not really integrated into formal, more stable forms of wage labor. And it is, in fact, predominantly excluded from the global regional circuits of production. So let me give you an example to maybe picture this a little bit more concretely. So I've done research on the cashew processing industry in Mozambique. Mozambique is a producer of cashew nut. It was the world's most important producer of cashew nut back in the 1970s. Now this is not the case anymore because there are many other important global players. And India is one of them, since we talked about India with you before. But still, Mozambique continues to produce cashew nut and it has some processing capacity. So the cashew nut processing industry is one of these export-oriented industries that are relatively important in the country. So one issue that is widely talked about in the context of the cashew processing industry is absenteeism. And in particular, employers spend a lot of time complaining about how Mozambican workers are often absent from their workplace. So there is this problem of having a fluctuating workforce and also very high turnover with people performing this job for short periods of time and then abandoning it or not engaging with it on a regular basis. And indeed, in my research, I did see that the workforce in these factories is highly fluid. But the reason doesn't have anything to do with the kind of preferences of Mozambican workers, but it has to do with very material conditions. One of them being that very often these workers are not only wage workers in the cashew factories. And this is because the cashew factories are one prime example of an occupation that pays very low wages that do not allow workers to really make a living. And therefore, this means that workers need to combine the work in the factory with other forms of casual, seasonal work, cash earning activities. And sometimes they're absent from the factory in order to pursue these other forms of work. In addition, in the case of women who dominate the workforce in these factories, so this is again another kind of very typical illustration of a female-dominated export-oriented industry. in interviews that I have conducted, many workers told me that, and I'm talking about women workers in this case, they had to take some days off work in the factory because they had to carry out domestic work at home. And of course, this is compounded by the fact that the work days in the factories are very long. And this is once again, or in turn, combined with poor road infrastructure, poor transportation, which means that often workers spend all daylight hours either going to work or being at work. And that's why then they need to be out of work from the factory in order to perform other forms of work at home when needed. And in addition, many workers complain about the lack of understanding on the part of the employer of the social necessity to take some days off to attend the funerals and other ceremonies, which goes back to that point that I was making earlier on how, this might seem trivial from certain, perhaps some more Western perspectives, but in fact, participation in ceremonies and rituals is a very important component of reproducing society and belonging to certain communities. Of course, there are more reasons, but I think that these are some of the most important reasons why we see absenteeism and high turnover in these factories. So this is a specific illustration that I've used that I hope provides a little bit more of a concrete image of what I'm trying to talk about. But the broader point is that in peripheral economies, where social reproduction imperatives are minimally mitigated by the state, social reproduction remains fundamentally family-centered. And people face many challenges to ensure that they can sustain themselves and their families. So in this context, social reproduction is not residual to capitalist production, as it is sometimes portrayed. And I think particularly in economic thinking, we tend to consider capitalist or productive processes first. And then if we look at social reproduction in those rare occasions, we just see those as an add-on or as a residual component. In this case, it's exactly the opposite, right? So people need to think about sustaining themselves first. So social reproduction comes before and shapes engagement with productions, how people are, for example, able to perform work in these cashew factories.
Sarah, I would want to keep listening to more of these examples, but maybe we can sort of circle back and go back to the question of development, right, that we began with even in the first segment. And if you could reflect a bit on what does social reproduction reveal about the process of economic development?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think it's very important to end on this point in which we try to understand how social reproduction matters for broader processes of development. So taking a social reproduction approach reveals that there is an increasing fragmentation of the means of social reproduction in peripheral economies in the global south, and particularly in contexts that are characterized by narrow and extractive productive structures, which I think is the case for not all countries in the global south, but for a good portion of them. So the social reproduction imperatives in these contexts are met in conditions of chronic, pervasive precarity of work and life. And this means that people, by which I mean both workers and surplus populations more generally, are trapped in forms of precarious and exploitative dynamism. So I think what I call precarious and exploitative dynamism is something that I got at through mixed method qualitative research focused on specific cases in Mozambique. And I think that it is just a different perspective on something that you have documented in more systematic ways for India when you talk about a certain dynamism within an economic structure that is otherwise very much the same. So I think it is interesting also to highlight these connections. And so this reality of precarious and exploitative dynamism bears implications for development processes more broadly. So I think I can highlight three implications. First, and quite obviously, the fragmentation of social reproduction has detrimental effects on labor through the unmitigated reproduction of intersecting forms of marginalization and oppression, which means that poor families, those where women are the main earners, and also migrants with no or limited family support find themselves in the most critical circumstances. So this is in the context of Mozambique, right? But one can think of how this plays out in different contexts. But second, there are also negative implications for capital accumulation. And this occurs via negative effects on labor productivity, because you can imagine that in the context of very high turnover and high levels of absenteeism and the general difficulty that workers face to maintain a regular job, this bears implications for the productivity of labor in specific sectors. And perhaps more indirectly, and this is the third and last channel I want to mention, we see negative effects on capital accumulation through foreign capital volatility. So the lack of basic infrastructure that can be understood from the lens of social reproduction makes foreign investors more inclined to withdraw from a country like Mozambique in times of crisis. And particularly in the cashew sector, there have been a couple of global players that have withdrawn from the country and closed down some factories during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. So social reproduction is really about trying to understand how labor and life are reproduced and how productive processes can sustain such reproduction and be organized in ways that are compatible with what people do in the rest of their lives without, not looking at that or taking that for granted. So in conclusion, I think that we need to bring social reproduction into development with the aim to reclaim a feminist political economy understanding of development, not only as an add-on or specialized knowledge, but as a fundamental component of the analysis of development.
What was quite crystal clear, Sara, was that whatever we try to understand in terms of labor processes, production processes, would only be partial unless we plug in the idea of social reproductive production, unless we introduce the aspect of social reproduction as a constitutive part of it. Thank you very much for engaging with us on this very crucial topic. We're truly grateful, and thank you all for listening to the second segment of the episode on informal economy and social reproduction in the Global South of the DevTrack podcast series with the fantastic Sara Stevano.